and welcome to Grade.com Talks With. Today, we're talking with Andrew Fenning, Director of Strategic Partnerships at Love Justice International, an organization that is fighting world's greatest injustice of human trafficking and has intercepted over 24,000 individuals to prevent them from being trafficked. And if you're new to our podcast, please press subscribe button either on YouTube or your podcast app, because today we're going to learn about an organization that envisions a world where every human life is valued. Hello, Andrew. Welcome to Great.com Talks. It's very excited to have you here.
Thank you, Kareem. I'm very happy to be here.
Wonderful. Could you please describe Love Justice International for someone who is not familiar with your work?
Yeah, so we are an anti-trafficking organization that started in 2006 and primarily began doing what we call transit monitoring in Nepal and built up an operation there before expanding to 17 or 18 countries now. And so it's a scalable model of prevention that we believe has a lot of potential to grow further around the world.
It's great to see that you have been able to implement monitoring, as you mentioned, in Nepal, and now you're able to do so in many different countries, in over 17 countries, and that's in a short period of time. You've been able to help over 24,000 people, which we'll discuss further on in detail. But it's great to see that you're doing the work and being in the front lines and addressing this issue of human trafficking. For people who are not familiar with the issue, could you please tell us how big of an issue is human trafficking and what are some measures being taken at the moment to prevent it?
Yeah, so it's important to know that slavery, modern day slavery, is illegal in every country on the planet. So there's no place where this is allowed and legal, but there's also no place where it doesn't exist. So every country on the planet has slave labor or forced sex slavery. And it's a massive global problem. So the numbers, the estimates for the number of slaves globally is notoriously difficult to estimate because human trafficking and slavery is a crime that happens in the dark, right? So in villages, people disappear, and it's impossible to know with certainty why they disappeared until you find them. And so for missing persons, for migrant workers who never return home, it's just very difficult to know if trafficking was the cause. But there are organizations and governments that make estimates, and the most recent, probably the most credible, is between 40 and 45 million slaves in the world today. And to put that into perspective, with the global population, that's about 1 in 200 people roughly. And so if you think about, I don't know, my town is small, but even in a small town, if slaves were evenly distributed across the globe, there would be several in my neighborhood, right? And so this is a massive problem, and it's concentrated in certain parts of the world and not others, which is why many in the West are maybe unaware of how big of a problem it is. And again, to go back to the estimation problem. Anecdotally, in 2013, the global community, the estimate was about 24 million slaves. In 2015, it was around 35, and now it's between 40 and 45. And this isn't because the number is doubling that rapidly. It's because our methodologies have changed, our assumptions have changed, what we count as slavery has changed. But it's a very difficult question to answer how many slaves, but in the United States, for instance, every single year in every single state there is human trafficking, and that is true in the most developed countries, and in some of the underdeveloped countries it's even worse.
Mhm. Yeah, although human slavery is illegal in all the countries, as mentioned, yet the practice is still on, and the numbers are shocking. 45 million people around the world being enslaved in 21st century. You would think that with the progress that we've made, there would be a progress. And unfortunately, The numbers are indicators that the issue still exists and it needs to be addressed and the solution needs to be found. Could you please tell us what are some of the reasons why human trafficking exists and what leads to the existence of this issue?
So let me maybe explain our model of interception, and that might help kind of answer this question as well. So I think in the anti-trafficking world, it's important to recognize the different approaches, the different strategies of combating this issue. And there are lots of great organizations and governments doing this work. But on the pre-trafficking side, we have a prevention method known as awareness and education, and that's focused on vulnerable populations and giving them the tools and the information they need to avoid being trafficked. It's fairly intangible. You can't prove the effectiveness of that, but it's important work. On the other end, the post-trafficking intervention is rescue, recovery, rehabilitation. And so these are organizations and governmental agencies often who identify where traffic or where slavery is occurring, and they take down the factories or the brothels and free the victims of trafficking from those situations. Really tangible, really important work. Obviously, much of the exploitation and abuse has already happened. And so for those victims, the road to wholeness, to flourishing can be very long and difficult, and rehabilitation is very costly. Again, it needs to be done. It's important work. But our work at transit monitoring sits right in the middle of those two. So we have trained staff who are at high transit areas like border crossings, airports, train stations, bus parks, where there's a concentration of travel, looking for the red flags that someone is being trafficked. So to go back to your original question, much of what we intercept, our number is actually closer to 26,000 interceptions now, over 25,000. And many of the people that we assist are people who have been tricked into going willingly with a trafficker. So a trafficker preys on the vulnerable. So these might be people with low education. It could be that they're come from poor families and they're just looking for economic opportunities, and they're offered a job that's too good to be true. They're told that they can live a better life somewhere else and send money home to take care of their families. And so people are drawn by hope into these dangerous situations. And so our staff look for these signs that someone is traveling in that. We look for profiles of people who are targeted by traffickers and intervene in that moment. So our goal is to get them pre-exploitation. So the crime is unfolding. We're getting them as the crime is happening, but before they've been abused, so they can be returned home safely in that moment. That window is really short between freedom and slavery, but that's what we're looking for. Return them home safely, and then they have other opportunities that they can pursue for economic gain. And so traffickers are sometimes opportunists. They just know someone's willing to pay for, let's say, a young girl. And so they befriend them and then lure them to a place where they're told they're going to give a job. Maybe it's a false romance. They woo them into a relationship and then take them someplace and sell them. And then the demand is global as well. So I think for one message I have for a Western audience, I'm in the United States. I live in Indiana. That even though we may not own slaves or buy slaves or traffic in people, that it's difficult to separate ourselves from the demand side. Our craving for cheap products, even the use of pornography and prostitution and things like that, all of that is fed by human trafficking and the abuse of human beings. So we have a responsibility, even if we don't live in a country where everyone we know has slave labor, for instance.
Yeah, you mentioned that there is pre-awareness work and there is post-factum work that is being done by individual organizations as well as the individual governments around the world. But what I really like about your approach, as mentioned by you, of transit monitoring, is that you see that opportunity window before between freedom and slavery, and you take the action right away so it doesn't happen. So you already know that this is going to happen, but you prevent it from happening in mentioned by you in the transit areas. But would you mind sharing an example how this your expert would determine? You mentioned there are certain profiles that you see, but how the journey might look like for a person who is about to be trafficked, but through the help of transit monitoring, they are stopped and they are intercepted.
Yeah. So from the victim's perspective, it can take a while for them to make the decision to move. But the most desperate people are the ones who are the easiest to lure, because life where they are is very difficult and they see very little hope for the future. Right. So someone can come in and tell a story of a better life and lure them away easily. From our perspective, we're looking. We differentiate between what we call high risk individuals and evidence of trafficking. So we kind of have two different categories, and both are worth assisting. But we'll look for a profile of people that we know traffickers are targeting. So often in some cases, and we customize this in every country. There's not a universal strategy that traffickers use. And in many ways, it's an arms race where we figure out their strategy and we fight it, and then they adjust because of what we're doing. So this is a fluid tool that we use, but we have a profile of people that we know are being targeted. So in certain places, it could be young boys who are forced to work on fishing boats, and they have to dive down and untangle the nets, and often are killed in that process. It could be teenage girls who are lured into brothels across the border. Sometimes it's in the same country from point A to point B. But depending on where we are, we're looking for certain things. And if someone meets that profile, it's as simple as just starting a conversation. And so our staff are looking for as many people as possible that they can just talk to find out if they're safe, if they're scared, if they're nervous. Sometimes victims are drugged, so they're compliant. And so we're looking for signs of that. It just depends. But then if we have something called red flags. We have a tool called the questioning protocol. And our staff initiate these conversations. And then through hearing the story of the potential victim, we can identify red flags. Sometimes it could be someone who is from a poor community who's wearing new clothes and going to meet somebody across the border at a cafe. That's a red flag. And some of these are more severe than others. But if we can accumulate enough of those, we initiate an interception and try to convince the person to return home or to a place of safety that we determine. We don't have the power to stop anybody. And so in the course of this work as well, a partnership with local law enforcement to make arrests. So two metrics that are really important to us are the interception and the arrest. And the arrest is the metric that we believe will have the biggest impact on deterring this sort of behavior by the traffickers. So if we can get people behind the bars, they lose money, they lose their freedom. And then we pursue those arrests through to conviction. So one metric that we're really proud of is between 30 and 40% of closed cases end in conviction, which is actually quite high. I know that sounds low, but it's actually quite high for the average in the places where we work. And so that's really important to us. The other thing to mention, we talked about how this happens in a black box, and these estimates are really difficult. Because of our unique strategy, this transit monitoring, when we make an interception, we have a witness who has ideally not been abused yet, who can give testimony to the ways they were lured, the lies they were told. We can collect information on the route they took from their village to the point of interception, the demographics of the traffickers, and any support or friends that they might have, phone numbers, descriptions, etc. We can collect dozens and dozens of data points on an active case of trafficking that we can then use to create evidence against these traffickers. That's incredibly powerful because when you educate someone before the fact, no crime has been committed. And when you rescue somebody from slavery, you might get a brothel owner or a factory owner, but all of the support systems up to there are almost impossible to identify. And so this data is a really, really important outcome of this model that we're leveraging as best we can and sharing with any organizations in this fight that can use it to improve their own operations against trafficking. So we want to have the data that gives us the best picture of how trafficking is happening in a region and eventually globally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you meant what I liked about your explanation. You mentioned that you want to, because you are creating an evidence, and you have helped the victim, the potential victim, and then you are able to gather evidence around all the processes that happen in the human trafficking division, like not just post factum, the mentioned factory owner or brothel owner, but indeed the whole ecosystem around it. So there is you don't take off one player, you take off the whole organization, mafia or something like that. So
that's the vision, that's the mission. Yeah,
it's great.
And we have a new tool we're just working on right now called heat mapping, where we can route the geospatial route from point A to point B, and then stack up all of our data points on top to find places where maybe there's a hub, maybe there's a hostel where a bunch of traffickers are being supported. Maybe there's a particular bus route the traffickers are using that we can target. So instead of just waiting at the border, we can be more active in placing interception transit monitors at places where we know traffickers are overlapping frequently. So all of the data is incredibly important.
Yeah, it's great to see that you're focusing on putting traffickers in jail, and you were able to do that in the jurisdictions that you work in. Most of the cases, the closing rate of 30 to 40%. But in the jurisdictions that you're working, are the enforcements, are the punishment is sufficient enough to stop potential traffickers in the future?
It really depends on the country, and some countries have more developed or sophisticated institutions than others. There are places where if you get a conviction, the trafficker is in life in prison, and so we get far fewer convictions there because the punishment is so severe. There are other places where it might be a slap on the wrist, a week or two, and which is totally insufficient for the crimes that are being committed. So we have to work within systems that exist and do our best. Part of what we do as well is training police on what to look for and how to identify it, and building awareness in those partnerships. Everywhere we work on the ground, we try to partner with law enforcement and raise awareness of the extent of the crime, the abuse inflicted on the victim, so that we can get some more severe punishments for those who are guilty. So in some cases, it's a deterrent. It's always worth an arrest, even if it's a slap on the wrist, because it's a loss of income. It's a warning to others, and so we'll continue to pursue that even in places where we wish the convictions were more severe.
As you and your organization are experts in anti-human trafficking and the solutions for human trafficking, could you please tell us what are some of the suggestions that you would make for the governments around the world to make sure the number of 40 million or 45 million that is today could be decreased?
I think in some places the law enforcement and judicial systems are so overwhelmed that the crime, because it's invisible, because the victims disappear and they're not a squeaky wheel, so to speak, it goes under the radar as as not a high priority. And so it's perpetual in that case. So we try to set up operations where we're really called to work is often in places where traffickers operate with impunity. And so we are trying to be that squeaky wheel, right? We're trying to be the noisemakers that say this is a crime that you have to keep an eye on, and looking for those partners in positions of authority who agree with us and will act when we bring them the information. So as far as recommendations to government, it's to recognize that it happens. And as we collect data, part of that is just to make the extent of the issue in different countries available to those who have the power to make the difference. That's also part of the value of the data. But it's a crime that tears away at the social fabric and leads to so many of these other crimes that do rise to the attention of limited law enforcement. And so it's a foundational crime that deteriorates the society's view of human beings, that treats them as cattle, that views them as less than, as something just to be abused for personal gain. And there's no society in the world that can flourish with that view of humanity, right? Mm-hmm. And so we when we have the ear of someone in authority, that's what we say, that this has to be a higher priority because it's a foundational crime against the value of all human beings.
Absolutely. As vision of your organization, we need to build the world where every human life is valued. Once every
Absolutely.
human life is valued, then we can stop human trafficking. So that's that's the key to finding and building solution around this issue. Could you please tell us about your project Beautiful and the results of it?
Yeah, so we are an entirely nonprofit organization. Organizations exist to create value, and so for businesses, they can charge a fee for the people they create value for, right? But we're in the business of destroying value. We want to destroy the value of human trafficking, the economic gain that traffickers have by exploiting other human beings. And so the people we benefit cannot pay us for that service. So we have to raise money. And Project Beautiful is the community of donors that we have around the world now who give a donation every month to keep us in this fight. And we have some great donors who give large checks, but these small monthly donations are really valuable for us as we make plans. We've been expanding the last few years, and expanding takes a vision of the future, but also a knowledge of your budget. And so Project Beautiful is that tool that gives us monthly revenue where we can make plans for expanding stations, hiring more staff. We have close to 200 staff doing this work around the world on the front lines, and we want to increase that number everywhere we can. The need is great. We're not at capacity for the places where transit monitoring can work. We're limited by budget. So would welcome anyone who wants to join this fight. Projectbeautiful.org, lovejustice.ngo, both of our websites where you can learn more about us and get involved.
Wonderful. The link to the Project Beautiful's website and the Love Justice International's website will be provided in the description. So you viewing and listening, go to the website and familiarize yourself and make and support Love Justice International fight against human trafficking. Thank you so much, Andrew. It was wonderful to get to know you and very meaningful work you and your organization is doing.
Thank you, Kareem. It was my pleasure. Appreciate the invitation.
For you listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, please press like and share button because this will show the YouTube and podcast algorithm that this conversation is important, that we need to create a world where every human life is valued. Thank you and see you in the next episode.